6-year-old Lisa Steinberg, whose adoptive parents are charged with her brutal murder. Those who gathered tonight to honor Lisa had their own special reasons to be touched by the child's death.
29-year-old Awilda Lopez is charged with murdering her own daughter.
In an eerie way, this little girl's tortured life, her age, just 6 years old, even her name, Elisa, brings to mind the notorious case of Lisa Steinberg.
These are the conditions in which 4-year-old Nadine Lockwood lived and ultimately died. Garbage underneath her filthy crib, a lock on the refrigerator, one with nothing inside but spoiled food. On Sunday, Carla Lockwood was arraigned on murder charges, accused of starving her daughter to death.
Tonight, is this justice for Nixmary, who was battered and abused to the very end? Well, the case is not over yet.
I just don't understand how this guy just got away with it. He knew what he was doing to her. He was tying her up. He was doing all these bruises to her every day and beating her. And you're gonna tell me he didn't know what he was gonna capable of maybe killing this little girl?
In the winter of 2006, New Yorkers and others around the country would wake up to terrible news headlines about the tortured young life of a 7-year-old girl from Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn. Much like Elisa Izquierdo a decade before her, her name and her face would become synonymous with severe child abuse in this city. While the details of these cases might be difficult to get through, it's always important that we share their story. Friends, family, and neighbors in the community would find themselves completely heartbroken when they found out exactly what this little girl had been going through. In a case that shocked the city and shocked people across the nation, we just have one question to ask. Have things really changed since then? Today, on Evil Intentions, the story of Nixmary Brown. Nixmary Brown was born on July 18, 1998, and resided in the Brooklyn section of New York City. She was born to her mother, Nixali Santiago, and her father, a man by the name of Abdurrahman Mian. She had 2 sisters and 3 brothers, but they didn't share the same father. Santiago and Mian first met when they stood by witnessing a street fight in their neighborhood. 2 random people neither of them knew, but it gave Mian a chance to strike up conversation with Santiago and her aunt. The ice had been broken, and the 2 were starting to get to know each other better. The 2 would date on and off for about 6 months, and during that time, Santiago would have become pregnant with Mian's child. Mian never wanted Santiago to have his baby. He was totally against it from the start, but Santiago was determined to give birth to her child and be a mother. So, she would pack her things and move to a homeless shelter near Shea Stadium in Queens, without anyone knowing where she'd gone. Soon after, she would move to Connecticut and give birth to a healthy, beautiful baby girl. She named her Nixmary. Here, she would meet a man by the name of Edwin Brown, with whom she would share 2 children. Edward loved his children, and even though he didn't father Nixmary, he felt the same about her. She was loved as if she was one of his own, and now, she would have his last name. Nixmary and her family resided at 571 Green Avenue, and she attended PS 256 in the Bed-Stuy section of Brooklyn, New York. She was described as being a typical 7-year-old in a lot of ways. The adorable little girl loved to play with Barbie dolls. She loved playing with her cat Angel. She loved her classmates, all friends she had made since starting school there, and she loved her siblings. While in school, Nixmary would become friends with another little girl named Janelle, who would help tutor Nixmary, teaching her English and checking her homework. Nixmary's mother was born and raised in Puerto Rico, therefore, she grew up with Spanish as her first language. The child's aunt, a woman by the name of Iris, would state that Nixmary was a vivacious young girl who was always full of life. She would even write letters in school detailing how much she enjoyed her friends and spending time with them. She would also go on to say that little Nixmary was so determined to know English that she would go around picking up everything she could, trying to read it. She knew that she wanted to communicate with her friends as best as she could, and at even just 7 years old, Nixmary was focused. Nixmary's innocent smile and energy could light up a room. Here, we see Nixmary on one Halloween, her precious smile radiating, just happy to be able to celebrate Halloween with her siblings. But the truth is that behind that smile, there was a little girl whose young mind, body, and spirit were being put through the worst treatment imaginable. Normally, I'd like to tell you about the happier times she experienced, the people who loved her and the ones who wanted to see her grow into the intelligent and goal-oriented young woman she was no doubt destined to become. But in the year 2004, the first abuse allegations would begin to pop up. New York City's Administration of Child Services was first alerted to abuse allegations in May of that year, but the claims of abuse couldn't be proven. The second allegation came in December of 2004, when little Nixmary showed up to school with a black eye. Her classmates were well aware, even at their young ages, that something wasn't right. Their parents wouldn't send them to school with such injuries, so what was going on with Nixmary? One classmate, another 7-year-old, who was friends with Nixmary, recalled her coming to school with a cut across her forehead. A social worker at Nixmary school, a woman by the name of Margarita Coro, would become increasingly worried with the condition she would often see little Nixmary in. So, she became determined to help. She wasted no time and made sure that she reported these injuries and obvious signs of abuse to ACS. The social worker cared for Nixmary's well-being and would have done the same for any other child. Cotto begged and pleaded with social workers to remove little Nixmary from the household. At one point, she even visited Nixmary's home herself, looking to take matters into her own hands because she feared the worst. But she was promptly stopped in her tracks at the front door by Nixali Santiago's boyfriend, a man by the name of Cesar Rodriguez, who was known for having a very, very short fuse. From here forward, the red flags would continue to pop up, and things would just continue to get worse and worse for little Nixmary. While the rest of the world thought everything was going well at home, little Nixmary was already enduring a traumatic childhood, and for quite some time. On May 16th of 2005, a guidance counselor who'd seen all the injuries Nixmary sustained made a call to the state child abuse hotline. She would tell them about all her injuries, not only all the bruises and the cuts, but the fact that Nixmary had been absent from school for 46 days. An ACS caseworker would visit Nixmary's home to verify these allegations, but for whatever reason, they couldn't. So, she simply accepted Santiago's word that Nixmary would soon return to school. While plenty of people who'd seen and known Nixmary tried their best to alert authorities and ACS, still, this wouldn't slow down any of the child's suffering. Little Nixmary was being beaten on a regular basis for doing things any other child would do. Cesar Rodriguez's temperament was not something to be taken lightly. While Rodriguez would try to paint Nixmary as a problem child with behavioral issues, the truth was that her and her siblings lived in constant state of fear when it came to him, because they knew exactly what he was capable of, and when he exploded, the end result was little Nixmary bearing the brunt of all his rage. She was singled out at any moment Rodriguez felt necessary. Her own mother would watch this on a daily basis and agree with this treatment of her little girl. A little girl she at first was determined to care for. Nixmary suffered not only physically, but emotionally, as she noticed that she was being treated entirely different. While her siblings got gifts during Christmas, Nixmary got nothing. While her siblings were well fed and taken care of, Nixmary was fed nothing. While her brothers and sisters slept in their warm beds under their sheets, Nixmary would be confined to a rat-infested bedroom, where she was often bound to an old wooden school chair and forced to use her cat's litter box as a toilet. She was also violated on several occasions. And on the night of January 11th, 2006, Nixmary's story took a tragic turn for the worse. It was clear that with all the torture and abuse that little Nixmary had endured, that this would eventually take its toll on her small and fragile body. But still, the beatings continued. On this night, Rodriguez became enraged when he came to realize that Nixmary might have broken the printer at home. He asked her siblings who was responsible and came to the conclusion that it was her. His rage didn't end there, as he would also become infuriated that Nixmary took a cup of yogurt from the fridge because it wasn't meant for her, it was meant for her brothers and sisters. Rodriguez went into a fit of rage, and he unleashed every bit of it on little Nixmary, repeatedly beating her small body with closed fists at full force. Then, he took off his thick leather belt and began to strike her with it as he said, "This is for your own good. What am I gonna do with you? When are you gonna stop?" The beating continued while the child's mother just ignored the attack and ignored Nixmary's pleas. He would then strip little Nixmary down of her clothes and take her to the bathroom where he turned on the cold water. He then grabbed her by her hair and dunked her face and head under it as he screamed at her. Loud banging noises and Nixmary screaming for her mother's help could be heard all throughout the apartment, until she was grabbed and had her head slammed into the bathtub at full force. Rodriguez would then grab little Nixmary's battered, severely malnourished, and limp body, carry her into the filthy room she was forced to live her last days in, and tossed her body onto the floor like she was nothing. She would lay on the floor in fetal position, moaning in pain, and uttering some of her final words, which were, "Mommy, don't leave me." Even when her mother had forsaken her, she cried out for her. Nixmary's cold corpse was found laying face up by her mother at 4:30 a.m. the next morning. When EMS arrived, they saw that little Nixmary's small body bore old and fresh bruises, ligature marks around her wrists and ankles, and a fresh wound to her head. She stood only 45 inches tall and weighed barely 36 pounds, less than that of a healthy 4-year-old. The home was a house of horrors, and this was the worst case of child abuse that the city had seen in a decade, since the death of Elisa Izquierdo in 1995. Both Santiago and Rodriguez were charged with second-degree murder and child endangerment. The details of what poor little Nixmary suffered would shock and disgust many across the country, especially in the city of New York. But more details would emerge and make her story even more heartbreaking. A DNA expert would later testify that Nixmary Brown's blood could be found all over the apartment and was found under the fingernails of Rodriguez. Her blood was also found on the jeans he was wearing the night she was killed. Her blood was on the white twine used to tie her to the school chair. Her blood was found on duct tape found in the bathroom trash can. It was found on the walls, a pink towel, a comforter in the bedroom, on a girl's blue plastic belt, and inside of the litter box she was forced to use for a bathroom. Jurors would hear this information and were understandably sickened by it. Cesar Rodriguez's defense would try to paint Nixmary as a child who bullied her siblings and couldn't be controlled. And then the defense would begin to claim that the one who delivered the final blow was Nixmary's mother. Both sides would go back and forth, and the defense would stick to this story. The defense lawyers of Cesar Rodriguez would also go on to submit a truly disturbing piece of evidence. In the master bedroom of this house of horrors, on a dresser, stood a glass jar with a blue lid, and in the jar, a fetus that Nixalise had put in the jar when she miscarried. The detective who found this in the home would also report on his other findings. The half-eaten cup of yogurt that Nixmary tried to eat was still in her room, and she was there on the floor with a purplish tint all over her body. But then, a secret witness, a jailhouse informant that testified on Rodriguez's behalf, would say something that left prosecutors completely sickened. They would say that Santiago beat and killed her own daughter because she caught her 7-year-old daughter on not just one, but several occasions. She'd become upset at this and decided that she had to go. Hard to believe that this is what they considered a good defense, when all it did was highlight just how much of a hell this little girl was forced to live through. While both sides continued to accuse the other of who inflicted the fatal blow, nothing changed the fact that little Nixmary didn't stand a chance while living with these monsters that called themselves her parents. The pictures you're about to see are the same pictures that were shown to a jury at trial. Now I have to warn that what you're about to look at is truly disturbing, so if you want to skip over this portion of the video, trust me, I understand. As if this entire story isn't already the most heartbreaking thing to sit through, a jury would also be shown shocking surveillance footage that showed Nixalise Santiago, Cesar Rodriguez, and all of Nixmary's siblings shopping for toys and candy at a nearby Target, all while Nixmary remained battered and alone at home 3 days prior to her death. Cesar Rodriguez was sentenced to 29 years in prison for the death and torture of Nixmary Brown. Nixmary Santiago was sentenced to 43 years in prison for her role in the death and torture of her own daughter. She received more time since she was previously convicted of 4 lesser crimes: for binding Nixmary to her chair with a bungee cord, giving her a black eye, for endangering her welfare, and for unlawful imprisonment. The judge presiding over the case had this to say about Nixmary Santiago: "You may not have delivered the final blow, but were it not for your failure to act, Nixmary Brown would probably not have died from that blow. By your own statements, she gasped for air, moaning, and called for you twice until she died. You, Mrs. Santiago, ignored the desperate calls and left this little 7-year-old alone, and you did nothing. You had a duty to act. You were the mother." Santiago had no reaction when these words were spoken, and no reaction to her sentencing. Nixmary Brown's funeral was held at the Ortiz Funeral Home in Manhattan's East Village. Many would attend to pay their respects to this little girl whom they didn't know personally, but who lived on in their hearts through her story, with even former Mayor Michael Bloomberg attending. Many strangers breaking down into tears and expressing how they would have loved the little girl how she deserved had she survived. Little Nixmary's body would lay in her coffin, donning a beautiful white dress, her coffin covered in hundreds of flowers. But even in death, Nixmary was surrounded by rage, as the two sides of the family argued and almost fought just mere feet from the little girl's body. Understandably, tensions ran high, and this result to some was expected. Edwin Brown, the man who gave Nixmary his last name and helped raise her from when she was an infant, but wasn't around for her abuse, stated that he despised ACS for their failure to act. With every child death after Nixmary, he would be reminded of what happened to the little girl he helped raise. He had this to say in reference to ACS: "They were at fault and I blame them 100% for not doing their job. I thought they learned their lesson after Nixmary. They had a year to save Nixmary's life, and since her death, they continue to let more children die." The Senate would later pass Nixmary's law, which meant that parents of guardians who kill a child would receive a life sentence, no questions asked. More than 60 leaders in the profession of child welfare would send open letters to Mayor Bloomberg and City Council Speaker Christine Quinn, looking to create a big change, a change that this system still desperately needs. Nixmary Brown was buried at Cypress Hills Cemetery in Brooklyn, New York, the same cemetery Elisa Izquierdo was buried in. The two children living almost the same short, torturous life, and laid to rest on the same grounds. Both of their voices echoing from beyond the grave, highlighting the desperate need for change in this city and in this country. Barely 3 weeks after Nixmary's death, a 4-year-old boy from the Bronx was found beaten to death in his apartment. His mother and her boyfriend were charged in the child's murder. Even in 2022, Nixmary's story is a grim reminder that a lot of work has to be done. But there's no time to be wasted. Children are relying on us to make a change, relying on us for protection. Let's make sure we never forget, and let's make sure we make a promise to keep our babies safe, and let's make sure we keep that promise. Nixmary Brown would have been 23 years old.